Good morning. Good morning. My name is Heather Raspberry, and I am the Executive Director of HAN. And I'd like to welcome each of you to the release of the 2023 Housing Indicator Tool, affectionately known as the HIT. As many of you know, we launched this tool in March 2021, and each year we continue to update the platform to include another year's worth of data. So we are very excited to be here with you in year 3. And thank you to those who have been here on the journey from the very beginning. And if you're new to the HIT, it's a great time to dig in. Before we get into the program, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge our sponsors and partners who have made this year's update possible. Many thanks to Amazon Housing Equity Fund, Truist, Wells Fargo, and the Greater Washington Community Foundation. Without your continued support, this truly would not have been possible. It's more than a notion to put together the tool for a single year, but to provide the support needed to sustain the HIT is truly appreciated. And it's a pleasure to be able to align with funders who share the mission of creating more equitable communities in our region. I'd also like to recognize our research partners, the Urban Institute, and specifically Leah Hindi and Elizabeth Burton, who have worked tirelessly around the clock to not only collect jurisdictional data, but to compile and sort through this information and distill it down into the tool that you will see today. Also to Latoya Thomas with Brick and Story, who serves as our HIT policy director and keeps all of our ducks in a row with project management. Many thanks to you, Latoya. And also thank you to our panelists and moderator who have lent their time and insights and expertise to today's program. And finally, to our members, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, and all of the jurisdictions represented in the Capital Region who each year collaborate with HAN in completing the surveys that ground the HIT analysis. HAN members, whether you're a developer, a service provider, a government agency, are an extremely valuable part of this work because they are who takes this data and information and translates it into action to create more equitable outcomes for our communities. And it's these communities that we are working for day in and day out. What we know and what you will see in the tool is that housing affordability does not discriminate. For the barista that makes your morning coffee, or your parent's caretaker, or your child's favorite teacher, we all benefit from housing that is affordable, built with first-class materials and located in a thriving community. 374,000 is the number of housing units our region needs by the year 2030. And a large portion of these units must be targeted towards our most vulnerable populations, low and moderate income individuals and families who are disproportionately Black and Brown. In alignment with HAN's commitment to racial equity, the tool is grounded in a racial equity framework. So it provides key context on how we got here and why our communities look the way they do today. We truly hope that you will find value in this year's tool, which is more representative of HAN's entire membership footprint and tracks new key policies that impact our communities. Today is just the beginning. We're here to provide a demo of the tool and have a discussion with industry leaders working across the region. But what happens when we leave here is when the magic truly happens. How will you use the tool? How can your organization or jurisdiction leverage the data and policies that the HIT is tracking? Can you use the HIT in your advocacy efforts? We've seen the progress that is being made, and we are looking forward to all that is to come over the coming months. Systemic racism, the uneven effects of COVID-19, and the shortage of affordable housing paints a portrait of the Capital Region's housing affordability challenge. And an all hands on deck approach is required to deliver solutions that can solve for this challenge. And we must be equipped with the knowledge of where we stand in each jurisdiction to effectively meet the needs for housing supply in a more equitable region. The housing indicator tool holds all of us accountable to addressing housing affordability. And as always, HAN stands ready to serve as your partner in this work because we all have a role to play, regardless of where we sit. Thank you again for attending today, and we look forward to working with you as we continue to make progress on this critical issue. With that, I will turn things over to LaToya Thomas.
Thanks, Heather. Good morning, everyone. And again, welcome to the launch of HIT 3.0. So as we think about this year's tool, we think about centering the concept of housing and who is able to access housing and what comes with housing. So as we think about what quality housing means for people, we think about quality parks and outdoor spaces. We think about access to quality schools. We think about access to grocery stores and healthy food options in our neighborhoods. We think about neighborhood retail and opportunities to patronize economic development in our communities. We think about access to banks and other mainstream ways of lending and banking. But we also know that many people in our region, in our country, are living in communities where they're struggling to access housing and struggling to access many of these resources. And so that begs the question, housing for whom? So as we start to dig in, we start to see what's going on in our region, what's going on in our nation. Some facts to note that the racial wealth gap, which we all know still exists, is still staggering according to the Federal Reserve Board. Black Americans' net worth is 70% below that of non-Black households. The Black American homeownership rate, 44%, has increased less than half of 1 percentage point since 2011 and continues to lag behind most other demographic groups. People experiencing poverty are 49% more likely to live in areas that exceed the current national pollution threshold, according to the Environmental Defense Fund. 46% of Americans who rent spend more than a third of their income on housing, and 23% of those are spending more than half of their income on their housing. So how do we actually remove these obstacles to allow more people to access quality, safe, and affordable housing? So again, welcome to HIT 3.0, which this year we have focused on obstacles to opportunity, housing justice, and a path to equity. So let's set the stage. So again, back to our graphic of the house. What are the obstacles that have historically stood in families' ways of accessing quality homes, and what are the obstacles that still exist even to this day? Some of these things, if you're familiar with the HIT, we've dug into over the years and we continue to dig into over the years. We know about historic housing policies. We know how many of them have been rooted in racism and have created a lot of the geographic and income divides that we see to this day. We know the prevalence of discriminatory and predatory lending, both historically and present day. We know land use policies have historically been a barrier to entry for many communities, for many residents and communities, and even to this day, as we see attitudes around whether or not low density and moderate density multifamily can be introduced in single family communities. That is a debate that is widely spread right now in many communities throughout the Mid-Atlantic and across this country. Economic exclusion, isolation of populations by incomes. The effects of urban renewal that we still see even 60, 70 years after most of those urban renewal improvements have been made. Growing income disparity, increasing wealth gaps, particularly among minority communities, and environmental racism. So as we think about communities that are most impacted by climate change, and that includes heat waves, flooding. So let's talk about how all this relates to HIT, and particularly HIT 3.0. As everyone knows, we launched the HIT to be centered around racial equity, particularly for Black and Brown communities. We know that housing is only one part of the equation to achieving racial equity. And so this year we took a deeper dive on the barriers that exist to achieving racial equity. We've also provided an updated Faces of Affordable Housing tool to reflect both the DC and the Baltimore regions, which I'll highlight in a moment. We got a lot of great feedback last year around the Faces of Affordable Housing tool. And so that's a tool we've continued to try to update and improve because we know that it helps to educate, particularly helping people understand who is impacted by our affordability issues. We've also spent this year looking at expanded policies around environmental justice and climate action. So understanding where communities and which communities are impacted negatively, either through historic environmental decisions or even present day. We've offered expanded calls to actions with real life examples to try to help inspire the work that all of you are doing. And last but not least, we've expanded our reach with the tool. And so we're very excited to welcome the Baltimore region to the HIT this year. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague at Urban, Leah Hendy, to walk us through our shared housing challenges and the tool this year. Leah?
Great. Thank you, Latoya. You can go ahead to the next slide. Though the greater DC and Baltimore regions have many differences, they both share common challenges around housing affordability. More than 4 in 5 renters with incomes below 50% of the area median in either case are paying rents that are unaffordable. Next slide. And while housing in the greater Baltimore region is not as expensive on average as DC, both are losing low rent units. The graph on the left shows that between 2008-12 and 2016-20, the DC region lost more than 85,000 units priced affordable to a family at 50% of the area median, or less than $1,600 a month. The graph on the right shows that in the same time period in the Baltimore region, they lost 37,000 units priced affordable to a family at 50% of AMI, or less than $1,300 a month. And to tackle these housing affordability challenges, we need more housing across the income spectrum, both to meet the housing needs of expected population growth and to better serve existing residents. The DC region has a goal of producing 25,000 units annually, about 14,000 of which should be affordable to households with incomes below 80% of AMI to meet those needs. And the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments adopted targets that call for an additional 75,000 units by 2030, and for 75% of new units to be in accessible locations and 75% to be affordable to households with low and middle incomes. And while targets don't exist in the greater Baltimore area, the 2020 Maryland Housing Needs Assessment also called for increased production and more affordable housing. We hope that participating in HAN's Housing Indicator tool can help spur discussions about setting appropriate goals in this area. For the first time in the 4 years of the HIT tool, we're excited to report that jurisdictions in the greater DC region exceeded the annual production target of 25,000 units, which is an increase of about 1,000 units over 2021. 6 jurisdictions, Alexandria, Falls Church, the District, Prince George's, the City of Fairfax, and Frederick County all met their production target, 4 of which exceeded their target 2 years in a row. And 5 jurisdictions increased their housing production in 2022 compared to 2021. That's Alexandria, Falls Church, Prince George's County, Manassas, and Fairfax County. The 5 jurisdictions participating in the HIT in the greater Baltimore region collectively produced about 5,550 new units in 2022, more than 60% of which were located in the city of Baltimore. Out of the more than 25,000 units built in the DC region in 2022, 67% of the units were multifamily units. That's about 17,000 units. And over 70% of those new multifamily units were built in DC, Prince George's, or Alexandria. The Baltimore region, which is on the bottom of this graphic, had a much smaller share of multifamily units, with 28% overall, with the city of Baltimore accounting for 98% of multifamily units. Despite increased production overall, a renewed focus on affordable housing is needed. Greater DC jurisdictions reported building 2,507 new committed affordable units, which is about 500 units less than reported in 2021, and well short of the target for 80% and below at 14,000 units. This slide shows the breakdown of those units by AMI level in 2021 and 2022 for the jurisdictions that specified it. And there was an increase, though, in the number of units affordable at 30% of AMI and below. Only one jurisdiction, the City of Falls Church, met their 50 to 80% of AMI target, although Gaithersburg, DC, and Arlington were close to meeting their target at this level. But no jurisdictions were able to meet their target for 0 to 29% of AMI or 30 to 50% of AMI. In the Baltimore region, they reported 136 new committed affordable units in total, with about 112 in Baltimore, the city of Baltimore, and 24 in Anne Arundel County. In addition to looking at how many affordable units were built, we looked at the share of all new units that were committed affordable. And those would be any affordable to households with incomes of 80% or less, 80% of AMI or less. And we found in the greater DC region, only 10% of new units built in 2022 were affordable. And the Baltimore region, the same figure was around 8%. Arlington County led both regions on this measure, with 24% of all units built in 2022 as committed affordable at 80% of AMI and below. Several other jurisdictions had shares ranging from 15 to 18% of units, including Montgomery, Fairfax County, and DC. For the DC region, this 10% figure is lower than the share of units in 2021, which was 12%, but is varied over time. And one of the COG targets that I mentioned earlier for the DC region is about producing 75% of new units in activity centers or near high capacity transit. And we're able to measure this for the new committed affordable units. We found that in 9 jurisdictions in the greater DC region met that threshold for their committed affordable units, with another at 64%. And this is more than the 6 jurisdictions that met this threshold in 2021 and 2 in 2020. Across the greater DC region, jurisdictions preserved affordability for more than 2,000 units with existing subsidies or covenants. And 5 more jurisdictions reported tracking preservation, but not reporting any new units preserved last year. 3 jurisdictions in the Baltimore region are tracking affordable units with existing subsidies, and Anne Arundel County reported preserving more than 300 units. And 6 jurisdictions in the DC region also track preservation of affordable housing that is not subsidized and reported preserving more than 2,600 units as committed affordable in 2022. Across the DC and Baltimore regions, there were around 36,500 units in some stage of development, affordable units that is, with almost 9,400 under construction and 27,000 in the pipeline. And though the exact definition of the pipeline varies by jurisdiction, in most units have some preliminary plan approvals or have received funding approval from the jurisdiction. DC, the city of Baltimore, and Fairfax County have the most units under construction right now, while DC, Montgomery, and the city of Baltimore have the most units in the pipeline. On each dashboard, which we'll show you in a minute, we track 21 different policies for local jurisdictions because we know that addressing our regional affordable housing challenges will require a portfolio approach and policies in all areas to preserve existing affordability, produce more housing, and protect people from discrimination and displacement. On this table, we highlight a few of the ones that we've been tracking over the last few years. Nearly all jurisdictions have homebuyer assistance programs, for example, and most in the DC region have a policy to prioritize affordable housing near transit. And while many jurisdictions have housing trust funds, only 7 have a significant dedicated revenue stream. And as LaToya mentioned, as part of the survey for this year's HIT, we expanded our questions to jurisdictions to include a series on policies related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and energy costs in housing, and protecting vulnerable residents from the impacts of climate-related events. To highlight a few, 14 jurisdictions across the 2 regions provide funding or tax subsidies to help homeowners make their homes more energy efficient, reducing energy cost burden and greenhouse gas emissions. 10 have a climate action plan that contains goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate climate risk, as well as details actions jurisdictions can take to achieve those goals. Action items related to housing may benefit residents through increased energy efficiency, decreased utility costs, improved health outcomes, and reducing the risk associated with climate change related hazards like flooding. And this concludes our findings from this year's HIT. But before I turn it back to LaToya, I do want to acknowledge my colleague, Elizabeth Burton, who was instrumental in helping to pull together all the data and gather surveys for everyone. And I think LaToya has a demo for all of us.
Thanks, Leah. So we're going to walk all of you through the new version of the HIT that will be live later this morning. We'll start off with the landing page, and I'll turn it back to Leah to walk us through one of the dashboards so you can see what stayed the same from last year versus what's changed. Sorry, folks, give me 1 second. We're just going to restart the video. All right, so as noted, our tool this year is focused on obstacles to opportunity, housing, justice, and a path to equity. Similar to last year, we have a number of menu prompts at the top of the page, including hot links to get to any section of the dashboard, as well as the jurisdiction pages, and links at the top of the page to get to our resources, as well as the calls to action section. As you scroll down the page, we open up with our setting the stage for the tool. Again, this year, thinking about how we remove barriers and obstacles. You'll see some summary charts that highlight the data, particularly trends over the last several years since we launched the tool, as well as a comparison between Greater DC and Greater Baltimore around affordability challenges in both regions. Moving through the rest of the landing page, we move into our hurdles of racism section, which really focuses on those policies I highlighted as part of the presentation that have resulted in the housing disparities that we see today. In addition to the descriptions that you see, you'll notice there are hyperlinked resources throughout each description. So if you're not familiar with some of these terms or some of these references, we encourage you to click those links to learn more, to see resources, to read articles, but really to gather more information to understand the impact that these various practices and policies have had on our housing system and on our broader economic system. And again, we emphasize how the system of hurdles has really compounded over time. And again, only emphasizes even more so the work that our industry needs to do to further housing opportunity and housing equity and racial equity. We then move into our Face of Affordable Housing section, so who can afford to live in this region. Some enhancements to the tool this year. As noted, we are welcoming the Baltimore region. And so the tool has actually been updated to reflect both the DC metro area as well as Baltimore. understanding that the median rents and the AMIs are different for both regions. So you can toggle between the buttons at the top to alternate regions. The cards for the personas that are listed below also update in terms of income and other family demographics. As a reminder, all of the information with each of the cards is factual from real people. The photos are fictitious. Again, thinking through the policies and investments that are needed. As Leah mentioned in her presentation, we've added a few new policies this year, specifically around climate justice and the environment, and they have been grouped under our 3 buckets: preserve, produce, and protect. You will also see the links to the individual dashboards have been updated this year. We now have a regional map along with hyperlinks on the right-hand side that will take you to each of the jurisdiction dashboards. For those of you who remember HIT 2.0, this graphic is familiar to you. So again, we try to reiterate the role that each sector plays in this broader effort to further access to affordable housing. And with that, we also try to encourage folks to take action. And this year, we've really invested time and energy into our calls to action. So as you can see, the call to action section looks very different this year. Each of those buttons that I just hovered over will take you into a resource page that gives you very, very clear real life examples of what we've been seeing in the broader industry, housing and other industries as well, that help us understand what sectors can be doing to meet the need. And last but not least, we wrap up the landing page with our resources, including the link to the executive summary, advocacy tools, and requests to get an activation from the HAND team. And I will now turn this over to Leah to walk us through one of the dashboards. 1 second, there we go.
Thanks, Latoya. At the top of each dashboard, we have a set of fast facts with info about the size and of the jurisdiction. And you can also print the page or share it via email. There is a comparison box that you can select different jurisdictions that will appear in the policies section and the graphics if you would like to compare jurisdictions. The policy section I mentioned tracks policies to preserve, produce, and protect. If you hover over one of those question marks, it'll give you a definition for that policy. And then there's a checkbox to indicate whether the jurisdiction has it. This year, we have a toggle between the different policy categories to group them a little better. And the next section is our housing outcomes that are production and preservation data reported from the jurisdictions. You can use the legends to toggle on and off sections of the graphic by year, or in this case, you can actually toggle the multifamily or single family off or on. For the housing, affordable housing charts on the housing cost, for the DC jurisdictions, you can target between the number of units or the share of the target that jurisdictions are producing. And it's just the number of units for the Baltimore-based jurisdictions. And we have additional charts, including one on preservation this year, where we do display both units with existing subsidies as well as units previously unsubsidized. The next section highlights the inequitable outcomes that Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our region experience. And then following this section, the data portion concludes with a number of charts to inform jurisdictions about the housing context in their community. We go over income and change in income, as well as the rental supply, the change in the rental supply that I shared earlier, what the homeownership stock would look like as affordable to a new home buyer, and accessibility needs for households that may have a member that has a disability. And all of this data is available for download in the resource section of the HIT tool. And then finally, each dashboard has names and contact info for elected and appointed officials, so that visitors to the site know who to reach out to in each jurisdiction to advocate for an increased focus on affordable housing production.
Thanks, Leah. So how can you use the HIT? So we really find there's 4 ways to leverage this tool. Number 1 is the data. And as Leah mentioned, the data is available for download as part of the resources section. We invite you to compare the data, look for trends, and learn, particularly from the year-over-year trends that you're seeing. The HIT is also an advocacy tool. And so as we think about coming out of this current budget cycle, how can you use the results of the HIT to start planning for your priorities for the next budget cycle? The HIT is also a policy tool. So thinking about how you can use the data to help inform and advise policy recommendations and broader decision-making. And last but not least, we see the HIT as an opportunity for regional shared learning. So where are jurisdictions seeing success and where are jurisdictions struggling, and particularly where is there a common struggle to meet the need? I also noted earlier that we have expanded our calls to action section. This gives you just a snapshot of some of what you'll see if you dive into the tool. We have enhanced calls to action for each sector. So as you'll see, we offer recommendations on specific calls to action and then offer linked examples that will take you to a website, an article, another resource that gives you very, very specific examples to understand how other agencies, municipalities, corporations, and the like are finding creative ways to help meet the need. The goal with this new revised calls to action section of the site is to also keep it updated. And so as we learn more about what's happening in our region and even outside of the region, as we find out more great examples to share with you, we will continue to update this section for your resource. So what's next? So we expect to have broad discussions within the HAN footprint, and that includes the DMV. Baltimore, we anticipate that we will also be welcoming some additional Baltimore-based jurisdictions into the tool for next year. And we also would like to expand into Richmond. And so we'll be doing a lot of focused conversations around what that can look like for 2024. We also see opportunities for focusing on strategic messaging that can help all of you build on and amplify your calls to action. We also, as always, will have ongoing activations, particularly for HIT featured jurisdictions in order to highlight what's working. We'll also be refining and expanding our housing practicum series that we've done with regional municipalities in partnership with HRNA advisors. So we are anticipating launching a new version of that series in the coming weeks. And then HAN will also be launching its second Supportive Housing Institute with CSH. And that will be in Northern and Southern Virginia, all the way down to the Hampton Roads and Richmond area. So with that, that concludes our presentation on HIT 3.0, and we encourage all of you to learn more at hit.handhousing.org. And if it's not already in the chat box, the link to the newly launched tool should be available in the chat box this morning. I am going to stop sharing my screen just to see if there are any questions before we shift over to our panel. Leah, did you want to address the question regarding that's in the Q&A box right now? There's a question around dedicated affordable units.
Yes, I had answered part of it. Unfortunately, we only have the addresses for the committed affordable units, so we aren't able to measure the amount of all new units that are near transit or in COG activity centers.
All right, thank you. All right, and seeing no other questions, I am going to turn this over to our panel discussion. We have a very exciting practitioner panel set up for you today. So I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Stacy Spann, who is the head of Housing Access and Affordability in Philanthropy and Community Impact with Wells Fargo. Stacy?
Sure. Thank you so much, Latoya. Gonna ask that the panelists come on screen, and as they're doing that, would love for you all to relay to the HAND team. Congratulations for version 3.0. Tremendous undertaking. You've made a great deal of progress in just a few years, and looking forward to all of the things that HAND and the HIT tool have to offer. So panelists, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves. I'm actually really excited about this. It's been a little while since I've seen some of my HAND friends, and so I'm excited about what we're going to embark on today. We're talking a bit about HIT and how we can, as practitioners, use it. So why don't we start with some quick introductions, and while you're introducing yourselves, panelists, if you wouldn't mind telling us very quickly your why housing, and what impact you're hoping to achieve, and then how this tool, HIT in particular, 3.0, version 3.0, can drive impact. And why don't we start with Mr. Philip Cash?
Sure. So Philip Cash, I'm a partner at HRNA Advisors. HRNA is a public policy and real estate consulting firm. I lead our housing practice, which works with state and local governments to do housing plans and strategies, then design and implement the policies that go with that, and then underwrite and execute transactions. So down from strategy all the way through the execution. In terms of why housing, I got into housing by accident. I was doing work on mortgage lending before the foreclosure crisis, and got very interested in expanding access to mortgage lending, and learned a lot about, frankly, racial inequity and systemic racism within the mortgage process field. And that led me into the housing field and through the neighborhood stabilization program. And then I've been doing that ever since. And then with HIT, with the dashboard, I think it's powerful to have the numbers out there and have the truth, the truth of the challenge and the scale of the challenge and where actual work is being in front of folks. I work a lot with local governments across the country. And there's often, a misunderstanding of the challenge by several orders of magnitude. I'm always excited when we build 100 units, but in most places it's closer to 10,000 that we need to be adding. So I think, it can be daunting to look at the reality, but I think it's really valuable and generally drives us towards bigger and more important solutions.
Excellent, excellent. And just a quick word on what impact you're hoping to achieve in general.
I really, I see us as the technical experts to support local governments in doing these things. So both thinking through and understanding what the best practices and how to design the policy that fits their community, and then really supporting them in actual transactions and deals. It's hard to underwrite and negotiate with developers, especially when you have council members behind you who want to cut deals sometimes that don't always advance public interest.
There you go. Emmy, would you mind introducing yourself and answering the 3 questions? I can run over them again if you'd like.
I've got you. I've got notes. No worries. Good morning, everyone. So happy to be here and such an incredible tool that's being launched. My name is Emmy Reyes. I am the Executive Director of the Latino Economic Development Center, which is a DC-based CDFI. We work in DC, Maryland, Virginia, as well as Puerto Rico. And our organization really has 2 main branches. One is small business development. So we work with entrepreneurs in starting their businesses, expanding their businesses, and sort of graduating to higher, bigger financial tools. And then within housing, we have housing counseling programs, affordable housing preservation work, and tenant services. And so housing is something that we've are very proud of our work in that scope and understand its importance, because we know that housing is a very important tool for the foundation of improving generational wealth within our communities. And so we work primarily with the Latino immigrant community, and really our goal there is helping them get the tools that they need to improve their finances so that they can eventually start their journey to home ownership And more importantly, once they get to home ownership, is keeping their homes, right? How do we ensure that they have the tools they need necessary to do that and are able to weather the storm, whether it's a recession or the COVID pandemic? There's always sort of something that's putting them at risk once they've achieved that home ownership. And so we're really sort of trying to be thoughtful in how we improve our programs for that. And I'm actually relatively new to the HIT tool. And I was telling Heather earlier that I was geeking out to it over the evening and sending it to all of my directors. And I'm like, we need to use this in our programmatic planning, because I think it's such an important tool that really sort of showcases a lot of the population shifts that we're already seeing, right? During the pandemic, some of the areas that many immigrant people tend to buy homes. So PG County, for example, saw a huge decline in its population, and we're seeing larger increases in the suburbs of the suburbs, right? We're seeing them in Frederick County and those types of areas where more affordable home ownership opportunities exist. And so our goal in using this tool is really being more thoughtful in how we assist our clients and where that need is. And so that when we expand or look at new opportunities, we're going where the population is and where they need those resources most invested. So
Excellent.
happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. King, how about you, sir?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Charles King, and I am co-founder and principal at CSG Urban Partners. CSG is celebrating its 20th year this year as a real estate development and real estate advisory company. We are a mixed commercial, mixed use development entity. I personally have been in the affordable housing space since 1987, beginning in Boston, and working in underserved areas in Boston, in New Orleans, the Bay Area. I've been in Washington for about 25 years. CSG is a hybrid in that we do development, not specifically affordable housing, although most recently a number of our projects are primarily affordable housing, but we also work with a number of nonprofits, both locally and across the country, in helping them to leverage their hard assets to produce potentially affordable housing, like YMCA's, houses of worship, and the like. I initially got into real estate development because I'm sort of an outlier. I don't necessarily like working for a corporation, and working in the affordable housing realm gave me an opportunity to be creative, but also to help as many people as possible. And the organizations we work with tend to do that. And HIT 3.0 is obviously a very important tool to help really sort of contextualize what areas have targeted populations or targeted areas that are more advantageous for affordable housing, and then what are the tools, both public and private, that may be available, particularly the finance stack of getting it done. So I'm very excited to be here and to contribute to this important endeavor.
Excellent, excellent. Ms. Alexander.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. So why housing? I had a very interesting opportunity when I was growing up. I'm a Harlemite born and raised, so I'm originally from New York. And when I would walk to Catholic school, there were these two houses that I would pass called the White House and the Capitol, that were multifamily units that I'm just, as a child, I'm just looking at these dilapidated buildings and seeing this woman with her 4 daughters. Living every morning as I would walk past her, she was always taking her kids to school, and they were well dressed. Over the course of my 8 years in Catholic school, I saw her struggle physically, whether it was drugs and some other conditions, but the buildings were being renovated under Mayor Koch's participation loan program. I now know the terms now, but back then I didn't know it. And so I'm seeing these newly renovated homes, but I'm still seeing this woman there with her 4 children still in the building, still taking her daughters to school, even though I know that at that age that she was struggling with some challenges. As I got older and was in graduate school, my professor told me I needed to go back into my community and work for Abyssinian Development Corporation. And that's when I began to understand, housing. Yes, there's this whole world that you can improve the place where people live despite what's going on in their personal life, that you can create some stability. And so once I pieced together what I saw as a elementary school girl walking to school and seeing this one family that has always been my reference point, despite what's going on in a person's life, the fact that we can implement change and create a stable living environment for them, allowing them a chance to restart their lives or just not worry about this one piece of their life has always been an important factor for me. So that's why I do housing, because you get to create change, you begin to create some stabilization despite what is happening within a person's life, and it's just a piece of the puzzle. I am the Regional Vice President of Development at the Community Builders. I've been with Community Builders for 9 years. We're a national nonprofit organization that we do real estate development, community resident services, property management. We're a full service organization. And our goal and our mission is to build and sustain strong communities where people can thrive. And so that thriving, that having impact, that creating some level of stabilization and is why I do it. And it's the type of impact that I want to make sure that I'm doing in every step of the work that I have within my professional career and in my personal life. I am a steward of affordable housing. And so my goal is to try and stabilize communities and neighborhoods, even when it's not sexy and glamorous, even it's the most difficult and complicated, but this is work that needs to get done. And so I see myself as an agent of service.
Excellent. Thank you. Babatunde, you rounding it up. Let's go.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on this panel. I'm happy to be here. Everyone, my name is Babatunde Oloyede. I'm the president and CEO of Marshall Heights Community Development Organization, also known as MHCDO, because it's a lot shorter to say than Marshall Heights Community Development Organization Incorporated. And Marshall Heights, or MHCDO, has been in existence for 44 years to really bring resources and economic opportunities to underserved, under-resourced communities in the District of Columbia. And we do that through a holistic economic model where we bring 5 core capabilities to the community. That's real estate development, housing, small business development, workforce development, and health, education, and wellness. And through the combination of these 5 core capabilities, we're able to bring a lot of resources, a lot of opportunities to individuals that live in the District of Columbia, because when you develop the individual, you develop the community. And as a community-based organization, we're really working hard to make sure that our communities, not just the Marshall Heights community, but all the communities in the District of Columbia are thriving. And so in terms of the why, in terms of housing, well, as a native Washingtonian, I have seen the dramatic change in the District of Columbia. And I've always had an interest in real estate, but as a young person, you don't know where you can actually have that impact, where you can get involved. And then over the years, as I've seen and witnessed, I should say, the changes in this city has really encouraged me, or maybe some would say even forced me to get involved on the affordable housing level, because it's important that all of DC's residents get to enjoy the amenities and all of the improvements that the city has made over the years. When I grew up in DC, DC was the murder capital of the world, right? It was the home of crack and all types of crimes that were going on in the District of Columbia. And the city has really grown, it's really changed. And I really think that it's a travesty that long-term, long-standing Washington residents aren't here to participate and enjoy those amenities. So that's what drives us, right? And it's really the holistic model to make sure that everyone can participate, but not only participate, but have the resources so they can stay and thrive and live high quality lives. And then in terms of using HIT, well, I think in the presentation, it was really spelled out well in that it's a great tool for advocacy. And then as a real estate developer, we use it in terms of strategy, right? Like, where are we looking to do projects? How do we build the case, the business case to do this deal? One of the things that we're looking at as an organization is moving out of certain areas that some would say have an oversubscription of affordable housing, and moving into other areas that have less units. For those in DC, I'm talking about wards 2 and 3, moving into there and moving out of wards 5, 7, and 8, right? We want to make sure that we are opening opportunities to everyone to live across the city and not just have them concentrated in particular areas. So I think I answered all the questions. If I didn't, I'm sure that Stacy will let me know that
You know what? Absolutely, I will.
Okay.
But for our audience, you've gotten a flavor of the experiences, and the rationale for folks doing the work that they're doing, and quite frankly, the depth of experience and excitement about this work. So I'm going to push us into our next section here and start talking about some of the financial considerations. You all know what's happening in our economy, or maybe what's not happening is probably a little better way to put it. And so we're seeing interest rates spiking. We're seeing tons of instability throughout. We're starting now to see some challenges in the labor sector with layoffs and such. And yet we know that the need for housing persists. And so for the developers on the panel, how are you approaching development more creatively in terms of design and construction partners to achieve impact despite what's happening in our current economy?
So I would say, I'm sorry, you can go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
For a nonprofit developer such as MHCDO, we've always had to be creative in how we build our capital stack, because quite frankly, we don't have the balance sheet of a for-profit developer to come in and do certain deals. So it's really a two-prong attack for us. It's working with a local government, and then also finding partners, development partners that share a similar vision, a similar goal for doing affordable housing projects that will more than likely, as we all know on this panel, they're very challenging deals to begin with, right? So you have to be creative and find partners that are willing to roll up their sleeves with you and use that creativity and brainstorm to figure out how we can put this deal together.
Jackie, you were going to say something?
Yes, and I'll just add on to that, as we, as organizations that, when we're doing affordable housing deals, we're looking at a long-term game. This is not instant, right? And so these are projects that may be in pre-development anywhere from 2 to 4 years, depending on the factors that you've already spoken about, Stacy, as well as locality's ability to fund projects, right? So we have pipeline and so forth. I think one of the things where we try to be creative as it relates to holding prices is maybe have some early starts on work as we're getting closer potentially to a closing date, that we can do some early releases, get the general contractor to start ordering fan coil units, and stuff that needs to be shipped so that we can take advantage of that low pricing. Work with our intermediary partners at that time to potentially do some pre-development lending so that we can advance, holding some of those project costs. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult because the creativity is there. We're always able to be creative, but it's about having access to those resources to be creative. And so I think that's the challenge of a developer. We only can be creative if we have access, but it's important to have those partners aligned with us who understand this process and the nuances of our work.
Mm-hmm. Charles, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think I want to just add to that. With affordable housing, it's the long game. And I think I've been through now 3 or 4 up and down cycles. So yes, the interest rates are high now, but 2 years from now, they'll be back, hopefully at a place that will induce more housing. The two things that are very important, and because CSG works across the country, and I have the dubious honor of probably being the longest serving person in affordable housing on this panel, that, the available land area for the housing, as well as the project funding, are the two most important things. And so recently, I'm just overjoyed to see that municipalities and foundations and everyone have discovered houses of worship and other nonprofits that have been in underserved communities, sometimes the only community serving entity, for in a certain radius. And now they're saying, well, you have available land in this urban community with high appreciation land value. Are you interested in helping to create affordable housing, which may or may not be in mission alignment or ministerial alignment? It's going to take, the coin of the realm is trust. And so any house of worship is dubious of any developer that comes in and says, hey, give me some of your land, I'll build housing. It'll be a good thing for you. It'll be a good thing for the community. And so it takes a while for you to build that trust, to help the congregation, the leadership of that house of worship or that nonprofit to understand your true intentions. And so during this quote unquote down cycle of high interest rates is the time to be a little more proactive in terms of the blocking and tackling of getting to know what areas, what's available, looking for pre-development or feasibility funding, and then helping them to understand what the possibilities are. So, you know, interest rates come and go, construction costs go up, they go down. You just need to be prepared, and you need to just keep pushing and finding those nuggets of possibilities where you might be able to build more affordable housing and begin the process, because it's the long game.
Okay. Emmy or Philip, do you have anything you want to add?
I'm not a developer, so I can't say in terms of that.
Sure, I know. I just wanted to make sure. And we're covering everybody. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to keep it moving. So a couple things. What do you all think it takes from a leadership and strategy standpoint to allocate resources to projects and initiatives that have a deep financial need? And I think generally this is couched in terms of a CDFI, but I want to take it in a different direction, because we have so much expertise, and you all are working with virtually every possible subsidy there is, and inventing new ones. So would love to hear your perspective, and I want to start with Philip and Emmy on this one if they've got anything.
Sure. So I'm happy to lead off. So in terms of like so just Stacey, to repeat back to you, what it takes to actually dedicate or, put together the funding to get to deeply affordable units. Is that what you're?
I would say not just the deeply affordable units, but the initiative itself. I mean, what is it, what does it actually take? And apart from patience, which I think Charles got us covered on, right?
So I'll talk about it some, I think, from how I see local governments come at it when they come at it the right way, or what I believe to be the right way.
Sure.
It takes leadership usually at two levels. Usually it takes leadership at an elected official policymaker level. So one or more elected leaders understand the issue and see housing affordability and the access to opportunity beyond the project, but as a long-term issue they have to work on multiple times and you have to stick with. So it's not just, oh, we got to preserve this building because these folks are going to be evicted, or I need to go to some ribbon cuttings. This is a challenge for my community and I need to be making an ongoing long-term investment here. And then you need staff level leadership to actually push that through, because working with development partners and negotiating with development partners is a lot of work. Projects run into issues, and there's a need for flexibility that local governments does not always come easily for local governments. So I think that there's both leadership at the staff level and leadership at the elected official level. And then right now, I think I'm particularly concerned about a lot of my clients really relied on bonds and other short-term funding sources for affordable housing, which was great. I'm happy to get to the money. I think a lot of it was very, very well used. This is an ongoing forever commitment. And when the bonds are tied up and interest rates are up and people are feeling somewhat fiscally tight, that does not make it okay to cut funding. It's actually, from an impact viewpoint, it's exactly the wrong time to cut funding. So from just a technical standpoint, the more you can get to dedicated sources or ongoing funding streams for your initiatives, and not just one-time allocations, which I know is often hard for local governments for fiscal reasons, it protects you a lot. It protects elected officials from political pushback, and it allows nonprofit and development partners to build out their capacity or plan around those. And it actually is how you nurture strong ecosystems. Mm-hmm. So I think, the dedicated long-term funding is more important than cloudbursts of even larger amounts of funding.
All right, well, there are a couple threads I'd like to pull on later, but I want to get to Emmy first.
Yeah, and I'll let others sort of speak more about the housing fund, but I think an important part when we look at projects like this is sort of the economic development projects that go from a small business section, right? So there's a lot of mixed use projects. We have Walter Reed in DC, there's Canton in Baltimore, there's sort of the Arts District in Montgomery County. And so there's a lot of projects that sort of focus on the housing aspect of it and don't necessarily look at sort of how do we get more entrepreneurs of color into these building projects, right? Not just on the development standpoint of how do we get more developers of color involved, but also how do we ensure that the businesses that are going into these new projects are entrepreneurs of color who have a greater commitment to hiring local community members for their businesses, are sort of invested in a longer trajectory when it comes to workforce development than sort of chains or other much larger businesses would be interested in. And I think for me, one of the things that we're trying to push for is sort of similar to affordable housing projects when it comes to commercial real estate, right? And how do we design a sort of an affordable commercial real estate program that would really ultimately impact and benefit entrepreneurs of colors looking to get into these projects, right? Some of the things that we see, for example, in leases for new like food halls and things like that, is where tenants rent is by 30 to 35% of sales. And that's just to start, right? It's like a base rent of $4,000 a month or 35% of sales. I'm like, that's a very big difference. And how do we get entrepreneurs the tools and education they need to be able to negotiate better terms to be into these projects? And so I think the role of CDFIs play there is in terms of the technical assistance that we provide entrepreneurs for these projects. And then from a policy standpoint is advocating on their behalf to ensure that local sort of government is thinking about them as well when they're looking at these projects.
Okay, that's excellent. And so we've got 3 other panelists to get to on this one. I'd love to hear what you've got to say. And I also, since Emmy noted it, this equity lens, I'd love you to sort of consider that in this as well.
Stacey, if I can jump in there and just look at the leadership that's needed is long-term visioning. And I think where, one of the challenges that we face is a new administration, whether at the state level, at the local level, trends may change or the feeling of, we want to try something new. I think we're at a point in this industry where there's actually nothing new. It's just taking it off the shelf and implementing now because now's the right time. But there needs to be consistency that say, hey, we're looking at the Baltimore, DC region, and we know that development, that the population is going to increase. We know that as part of this region, we need to increase density. What is the long-term plan that includes the state and all the local jurisdictions to say, this is what we're committed to doing, right? It's also part of the economic development plan. It doesn't matter who's in the driver's seat at that time, but there are plans that need to be in place so that we're leading from ahead and not from behind, right? Okay. I think that is the most critical piece in terms of what we're missing from leadership. And then adding developers into that mix to think about, okay, so, we're looking, Prince George's County. So I commend County Executive also Brooks in looking at the Purple Line Corridor. The Blue Line Corridor is a big initiative. That is amazing. What are the other transit-oriented corridors within the region that we should be focusing on for development as a regional approach? What are the resources that the state is making available to the regions to allow them to go deeper in their planning and thought process? Mm-hmm. I think the leadership, to Philip's point, definitely coming from the staff, right? We have planners who are, planning from behind. I hate to say it, right? It's responding to the here and now as opposed to saying, you know what? I know that in Baltimore, we have East Baltimore, West Baltimore, and the pockets around. How do we continue to bring population and density to this area? And what are the economic development resources that we can, help leverage that? And then what is our partnership with the state, right? It is putting all the puzzle pieces together now that everyone is a part of the solution, but we got to get ahead of it as opposed to being reactive.
Got it. Okay. All right. Charles Babatunde.
I'm going to say something a little, it's not controversial. It's something of a cliche. I think people need to approach this from a humanistic perspective. Like, housing is, should I say, or dare I say, a human right? You know what I'm saying? Like, and because of that, it requires a certain intentionality from leadership at the very top all the way down. And there has to be that will in order to push these initiatives, these projects through. I think until we get to that point, I think we're always going to have these start and stops. And, you know, we make excuses or we couch it in terms of, oh, it's market conditions or it's policy, but we can overcome those challenges, right? If the will is there, we can overcome those challenges. So I'm just going to say that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Charles?
and I would just follow up and say that's absolutely right. It's the where and the what. And because if you have a specific project or you have a specific need or group and the local community stakeholder input is truly there and people are willing to, you know, envision the future. I'll give you an example. I worked in Arlington County over the last 15 years with the YMCA, and they have a site that they were willing to utilize part of the site for housing, but it required a zoning change. Now, this is 15 years ago that talking to the board, and because of the Y mission, they were willing to go forth. We had to go to Arlington County. We had to go through the GLUP process, which took, at least from when I initially started, until we finally got the zoning change, about 10 years. And now you go over there and it turned from one project into a small area plan. Now there's APA produced with the American Legion. They formed a collaboration. They have lots of veterans housing. There's housing everywhere now, and a large part of it is affordable. But 15 years ago when this started, everyone said, well, this will never happen. But the Y board was courageous enough to say, no, if you're willing to work on this, we're willing to do it. Here we are 15 years later, and there's housing there. It's dense. And so, you know, the leadership, yes, it comes from the policymakers, but it has to be grassroots with stakeholders who are willing to say, I'm committed to this, and, you know, just the blocking and tackling. And, you know, you will find the money. I mean, I've worked on a project on Baltimore Avenue in Hyattsville that had 21 different sources in the capital stack. You can find the money, but you have to have the will and the commitment, as Babatunde said. Otherwise, it falls to the wayside because this is hard.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Excellent. Well, audience, if you're tuning in, you've heard a couple snippets here. We've talked about supplier diversity efforts that are actually meaningful. Thank you, Emmy, for that. Phil was just at the edge of talking about where we are on being so dependent on bonds, and I think started to tear at the volume cap issues. Jackie, of course, as always, is quick to bring us back to reality and remind us that there's nothing new under the sun, except a will of the people that is born through policy. And Babatunde and Charles rounded this thing out with this real notion of, do we actually see folks, lift them up and say we're going to value them the way that we ought to value them? And if we do, then that ought to dictate everything going forward. So we're just getting this thing warmed up. And so I'm gonna lean a little more closely into this volume cap issue. We know that jurisdictions are facing this bond cap limitation. And what does that mean? Generally, it means that you've got preservation opportunities fighting with new construction opportunities and every bit of the undercutting that goes along with that. So as jurisdictions are exploring how to continue to support housing affordability, right? In this, it's not even a new climate, right? We've seen this story before. In this climate, how are we balancing new production with preservation? And I want you to jump in there.
I mean, I don't want to make this a short answer, but it's still to be determined, right? We're like in the middle of the storm right now, trying to figure out what's what. And I think that you're going to see at some point leadership on the government level making a distinct decision on which is going to be the winner and which is going to be the loser. right? And I know that even in DC right now, those conversations are occurring as to where can we get the biggest bang for our buck? Like, where
Mhm.
should we focus our time and our energy right now to help us meet our housing goals, right? And so those are the conversations are having. And, you know, I tell people to stay tuned because I really don't know, right? But I think that it is going to work itself out in the next 12 months, and people will see which way, you know, you'll see where the activity is starting to pick up. You'll see where a lot of what type of deals are getting funded and so on.
Mhm, mhm. Phil, you look like you're dying to
But-
say something.
Yeah, there you go. I don't want to cut off, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think the pitting us against each other to some degree, like about preservations versus new construction. Like, if I'm being hired by a client to do analysis on this, the answer is probably going to be, in terms of bang for your buck, preservation gives me the most impact. But that's the wrong, and I'll do that analysis, but that's generally the wrong answer, because if we're only playing defense, the population is growing, the need is growing. If we're not building significant new, then we cannot, like, we're not even trying to win. We're admitting we can't win. So I think Jacqueline's point earlier about there isn't anything new under the sun is right. So we got to go back to, what are the things that we can do for preservation that don't eat into our bond cap the same way? And, like, you know, Amazon came up with real money for the Housing Equity Fund. We were able to put in a lot of low cost capital there, and that helped a lot. But that's not a forever source. And even that was not, you know, even that was it was great. We did a lot. It's still a fraction of what we, you know, the scale we need to be at. So looking at what are the low, not the grant money necessarily, but what's the low cost capital? What's the combination? And, you know, Charles, I've never done 20 sources on a deal, but I always love, like, talking to my friends who do just market rate real estate. I'm like, they got debt, they got equity, maybe a little mezz debt, they got 3 sources, maybe 4.
Right.
I mean, so looking at, like, what are the tools we know, like public sector actors floating just general revenue bonds that are actually backed by projects. This is actually a thing that was very common in the 90s, early 2000s. All the people who
Right.
taught me how to do this always talked about it, but I've never actually seen it really happen in the cycle. You know, you see it a little bit in King County out in Washington State, but, like, I don't see it that much. I think we're going to have to go back and look at some of those tools and bring some of those back and combine them with tax abatement and maybe other sources, because otherwise preservation will eat everything, because it is the best bang for your buck, and we will lose 5 years or a decade. We'll be, you know, even in a deeper hole, which.
A couple things on that. One, I mean, we saw a snippet of it in 2008 when they were trying to save the economy. It just, you know, sort of popped in and then poof, it was gone. So yes, I agree that those revenue bonds are super important. And I want to also pivot and acknowledge something that Emmy pointed out, which was, you know, essentially, you've got, you know, this is broadly a fool's errand. She didn't say it that way. I'm telling you. She's saying, we're saying, all right, it's housing or bust, right? Which means we're leaving small businesses out in the cold. We're seeing the suburbs give way to suburbs, which are giving way to suburbs and eating away at the rural fabric of some of these states, and more importantly, causing us to spend infrastructure dollars in places where we don't have significant population and could frankly use that to support other efforts. And of course, you know, everything that Charles, Babatunde, and Jackie pointed out it remains true, that we are competing against one another, and the policies are making it an either or when it should be a also and, right? And so I want to add to this line of questioning, what you think it takes in this region, and I think it's a super region, but we can debate about that another time, what it takes in this region for jurisdictions to really prioritize affordable housing production and preservation, and to sort of hold both of those realities in an intentional, consistent way. And I want to start with Charles on this one.
Sure. Well, you know, it's amazing because CSG, because we do so much advisory across the country. We get to see a lot of ideas, a lot of inputs. And I will tell you that what Mayor Bowser has done here and the council has done here in Washington is extremely unique in terms of the Housing Production Trust Fund and the bond. When I tell people about a $400 million, they look at me like, I grew another head, because they're talking 20 million, 40 million. And if they somehow, I'm working in King County in Seattle, they're going from 30 million to, I think, 300 or something. And they, they're crowing about that, and they're, and jumping up and down. I'm like, well, we got there a while ago. So I think, it is grassroots. It is the mayor and the council taking the position that this is important. And, DC being considered at one point the most gentrified municipality in the country didn't hurt in terms of, pushing that. And I think somebody said, the term chocolate city hasn't been used in a long time when you think about what has gone on here. But when you go to some place like Seattle, where there's only 7% African-American population, or other places, this is very unique. The one thing I do want to point out between preservation and new construction and the policy and bonds is that there is so much money on the sidelines with foundations, with private corporate, the Prudentials, the Goldman Sachs. I've gotten money through all of those, previously Morgan Stanley, Bank of America. I mean, everything doesn't fit from everyone. And I've had any number of these entities say, well, we're only interested in certain markets. And DC is almost always on the list. But it requires the developer to go find this, right? They don't know how to find you, these corporate foundations or whomever. And so you really sort of have to be creative in trying to figure out, well, read all the journals or go to the conferences and figure out who has money. Then you have to have a project that's real, right? You don't want to shoot your shot and not have a real project. Now you're talking about feasibility. So you're really talking about going to the enterprises or the list and saying, hey, or the Goldmans, and saying, can you give me $50,000 just to bring on an architect, to bring on a developer, just to say, to put some drawings together, to make it real, to then take it to the foundation. But I've done all of this. It can work. It just requires more effort on our part. And then you can weave that in with the bond, but you now can leverage the dollars, and you can have a better execution on the capital stack, because it may not be a grant, but it may be low. I'm working with the ARPA, and I'm working with a life casualty fund in Boston right now, and it's 2.2%. So that's a big hit, to the capital stack. That helps. So you really have to be creative. I guess is over and over, I keep saying, you really have to look under every rock.
Okay. Others.
If I can jump in and say,
Sure.
I think we have to be revolutionary about how we look at housing. The state of Maryland has the Kerwin Commission, where we are contributing $1 billion a year. I don't want to say a year, but over a period of time, with significant amount of money. There was a commission that said, in order for our children to have this educational attainment over the next decade, there has to be investment by every locality into this Kerwin Fund. Well, if every child needs to be housed over the next decade, there needs to be money that's set aside so that we can create affordable housing, right? And so unless we have that large scale commitment, we're not going to have the impact that we need to really effectuate change and create, whether it's 85,000 units of housing that I think the Maryland Needs Assessment said that we're short right now. And I know that our localities is short, X number of thousands of units. We have to acknowledge that this is, as others have said on this panel, housing is a basic need. You cannot expect a child to progress in education if they don't have a place to live, they don't have a stable home, if their parents are not employed, if they don't have to deal with food insecurity. But that's all part of the work that we do. And so until you acknowledge that, you can't, and this has to be at from the state to localities, and to Charles's point, all of the intermediaries, there has to be a commitment to say, we want to make sure that people are housed and they have units that they can afford, and that we are going to commit, that we have the will to commit the resources, despite what's happening at a zoning level, despite who's in office, despite a new council person that's coming in that can't stand affordable housing in their neighborhood. Despite all these factors, you have to have a commitment to affordable housing and making sure that the resources will be built. I think this is where we have to get revolutionary. I think we're so quiet about talking about affordable housing and we also get a little bit more nuanced in debt and equity and so forth. Let's bring it back to what I think the HIT tool, focuses on who we creating housing for, right? And it's not just the post office service person, it's their children, it's families, right? It's single people. It's we got to put a face to the work that we're doing and saying this is a basic need.
So at the risk of being even more controversial, isn't there some fear of these faces being Black and brown?
Of course, but those faces are also white, right? Those faces come in different colors. This state is, you have people in rural territories that are struggling in western part of Maryland and eastern part of Maryland. So again, it's a face of America, right? It's not just the Black and brown, it is
Yes,
everybody.
but the point is that the face of America is increasingly brown.
But we have to challenge.
But I will tell you, Stacey, the widows and orphans story never gets old. And I've been telling it for 35 years. And you don't want to see families on the street, and you don't want to see families, without permanent wraparound services. And you just have to be loud. I think Jacqueline is correct.
Yeah.
You have to be loud. You have to be consistent. You have to have stakeholders. And you have to keep beating that drum, because eventually someone will hear you, and you go higher up. I met with 30, 40 ministers with the Secretary of Commerce. And the first thing she said when she walked in the room is, we have lots of money. And the ministers were talking about, how we can have some of that diffused into the communities for housing, for services and the like. They say they want to hear, well, be loud, be impactful, be focused, and say that housing, the bond cap is, how can you take some of that money? You look at the Inflation Reduction Act, you look at the infrastructure bill, we're talking almost $2 trillion. You look at that with, Justice 40 and the indicators when it comes to, environmental concerns, it's all there. And if you don't tell people that you need it to be served in this way and how it can be done, and the developers in hand and the tool, you've done the research to say, here's the data, here's what's really going on. I'm going to be loud until you help me do something. They're not going to do it. Everyone, it's human nature to take the path of least resistance. I get it. So if we don't do it, the people on this phone, the people who need our services aren't going to be able to do it. They don't understand it. It's up to us to make this happen.
Okay, excellent.
And it will happen if we're mindful of it.
There you go. Phil, you look like you're literally biting your tongue. Are you good?
No, just thinking about different things to say. So we've been focused on affordable housing, capital A, capital H. Just one of the areas we do a lot of work is on housing affordability, is more on the supply side. And I don't ever want to say supply is not a magic solution. It's not going to ever get down to your lower income levels. But it's also a necessary foundation, because if you're not building housing, then you're necessarily putting households in. We live in a free market economy. You don't have to love it, but it's an auction system for housing. And if we put households in competition with each other, our lower income households are going to lose. We're watching a fight in this jurisdiction, right? In our region right now, in a jurisdiction where they tried to do some upzoning, middle density. We've done work in Charlottesville, Virginia, where they're getting sued as well. This fight in neighborhoods where communities where people don't. It's not just they're concerned about Black and brown neighbors. They don't want neighbors, period. Any additional neighbors of any kind. Having that fight, I think, is a really, really important place for us to keep pushing and I think there's two opportunities for us there. One, to keep pushing that helps take the pressure off of, and really, I'm a big believer in the middle density. I've been disappointed in some of the things that happen out in California where they've upzoned, but they haven't really seen the growth and production that they should. And we all got to, I think, as Charles is saying, get into the weeds of like, well, this regulation or that regulation or this code, and keep coming at it until it chip away all the little barriers. I think that there's that takes pressure and actually, I think, addresses some of this. There's another piece there that I'm always very concerned about the fiscal side.
Yeah.
Every time you take a single family home and you turn into a quad or a duplex, you create a new tax base, and you didn't create a lot of additional infrastructure cost. We should be, whenever we push these policies forward, we should also be arguing for a portion of that money being set aside for support for access to home ownership or other things. Like, that's new tax base with very marginal additional cost. So that's almost all net profit to my local government, which is great. I just want a commitment that half of it's going to go to affordability and access to opportunity.
Yep.
The last thing I say we pushed on, and I think, again, I want to give folks who've been doing nothing new under the sun, but the buying existing buildings and market rate affordable buildings and preserving them. every time you do that, particularly when you do that in neighborhoods where folks are less than welcoming, it's an opportunity to open the door to those with returning prisoners, those with vouchers.
Yep.
They can't block me from changing the tenant selection process. They might be able to block the development, but they cannot block the tenant selection process. There was a condo building 2 blocks from where I live in Petworth that had some trouble during the foreclosure or during the start of COVID. We were able to take money from Amazon, buy the whole building. 40 condos are not going to be luxury condos. They're going to be permanent supportive housing. I'm sure all my neighbors would have been excited about this, but they didn't even get a chance to voice their excitement. It's just a thing that happened, and it's there. And frankly, most of them don't even know. So the ability for us to buy existing buildings and change who can live in them, or frankly, enforce the existing laws, I think is a tool to get, not that we shouldn't have direct fights with folks about this, but also there's indirect fights where you just buy the building and go around it.
Okay, excellent.
Um,
Go ahead,
There's
Mr.
one point that I wanted to add.
Please.
I know that we're talking about affordable housing and the focus of this is affordable housing, but I think we need to not gloss over the fact that this is a larger housing issue. And I think Philip touched on it, that, you know, across the housing continuum in terms of supply at all income levels, you know, there is the missing middle that we need to address, right? And so, and I think what we've created or what we have right now is a system that is creating a lot of downward pressure on all of the different income levels, right? So no one is moving upward in that housing continuum, right? We're all staying in our homes longer. And I think to Philip's point, if you increase the supply, you sort of add the grease to this system. Get people moving. And so I think in that over the long term, because this is a long-term plan, right? I mean, you know, it will help people. It should be, right? It will help people over the long term. And we can get some of that movement that we need so that people are starting to move up that stream and really not getting stuck. I think that's the issue, right? Is that we have a lot of people who are just stuck. So increasing housing supply overall, I think, will go a long way.
Great point, and it's an opportunity to pivot just a little bit. You talked about it being that grease, that lubricant, and so I want to give Emmy an opportunity to weigh on how that lubricant impacts small businesses, particularly those Black and brown businesses, and how we ought to be working in a more, and she noted this, a more holistic way to make sure there are opportunities that are sustained for those folks. And then Babatunde, I'd like for you to lean into this home ownership issue, speaking about the lubricant. So and everyone can weigh in. I just want to make sure we get to those two. So Emmy, jump in.
Yeah, I think two things come to mind for me. One is, how do we ensure that a lot of these projects and things like that get small business owners, construction owners, right? Those companies, those developers into these projects. One thing is saying, you know, a lot of these deals have like a quota, right? They'll say 20% have to be construction owners of color and things like that. But those business owners don't have the same access to capital to front the bill, right? Especially when it comes to government projects. I'm still waiting on a check from 2021, right? Like it's one of those things that not a lot of these entrepreneurs can front the bill for 1 to 2 years.
Which government?
I'm not going to call them out on this call, but if you want to talk about it later, happy to call them out then. And so in that vein, it's how do we ensure that there's flexible capital that allows these entrepreneurs to not be paying high interest rates on these deals when they really have no control on when they will get paid for these projects, right? So I think that's one thing, is ensuring that there's flexible capital or lines of credit that allows them to participate in these projects. And another thing is when we look about the placement of these projects, right? There's a lot of talk in DC of bringing affordable housing downtown. That's more than just plotting these places, right? Like, what are the transportation needs that they need, and what is the plan for improving that infrastructure, ensuring that they have like affordable recreational opportunities, stores that they can afford, restaurants that they can afford to be patrons on. And so it's a much more like larger thing than just checking off the box that you did you met one need of the community. You brought the affordable housing there. But then when they're not able to like stay there or have the resources to really like build a community there, it's often placed on them because they're low income or because they're Black and brown, they don't take care of their community in the same way or things like that. Rather than looking like being more thoughtful, learning from our mistakes, it's not just about placing people, but really building community in the new areas that we want to build these projects in. So for me, it's ensuring that we keep in mind every aspect of every opportunity needs to address more than just one point. It cannot just be the one thing and then expect things to work out for the community.
Okay, Strange.
know,
And I want to just point out that you gave the community builders a little shout out, and maybe that was a Freudian slip, but I think they're probably hiring. Babatunde, jump in there
Yeah.
on home ownership.
well, before I get to the home ownership piece, I want to piggyback on what Emmy was talking about because, and this is a shameless plug, so I'm going to put it out there, but that is what she just described is what Marshall Heights Community Development Organization strives to do. Like, we're in several real estate development projects right now, and like I mentioned earlier, we have 5 core capabilities, and we try to incorporate them into our real estate development projects. So we're helping the contractors, the construction companies get into the project to like help build it, right?
Mhm.
We're also doing workforce development where we're helping the individuals to get their certifications, whether it's on the construction side or the food hospitality side, if there's going to be restaurants in this new project, or on the retail side, right? So that when this project is ready, we have people who are ready to work. And then that allows those individuals to stay in the community because they're working in the community, right?
Right.
It's a real holistic approach to how you create and improve the community. And you have to be intentional with it, right? You don't start at the groundbreaking. Like, we have several projects that are still in the pre-development phase, but we're already having those conversations. We're already putting in that infrastructure so that people can get the necessary training, the necessary resources, so they can participate along with the project as it develops, so that when it gets fully stabilized, they're working at a retail store there or a restaurant there, or they're doing some piece of it, so that more importantly, they feel as though that project is for them. Because a lot of times when you see a new development and you don't see anyone who looks like you, or you don't know anyone who's working on that project, you don't think it's for you. And so then you have a totally different approach to how you treat that project, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so it really has a ripple effect. And that's why we have to be intentional about how we put together these projects so that we can ensure that they have the greatest impact on the community, right? And then in terms of the home ownership piece, well, I think that has always been a critical step in the American dream, right? Is home ownership is the probably the easiest way to build generational wealth, and it's one of those avenues that really hasn't been opened to people of color, right? And so we're trying to work through how do we eliminate those barriers, right? So I hate to keep talking about what DC is doing. I know Charles mentioned about the Housing Production Trust Fund, but I really think that DC as a municipality is really at the forefront of a lot of these initiatives. And I'm not saying they're doing the best job, but at least they're at the forefront trying to figure these problems out with long-term solutions that are effective, right? So last year, the mayor convened the Black Homeownership Strike Force, right? Which was brought together to help guide the city on how it should use its resources, both land and financial resources. And I would even say the infrastructure that is DC government, because there's a lot of different agencies that work together or could work together better to get people into homeownership, right? And so there were 11 recommendations that came out, but the idea is that there's an opportunity here that we have as a city. How do we approach this problem to reverse the trend of a decreasing Black homeownership population in the district?
Right. That's an excellent response, and it gives way to, I think, a broader question around economic development and placemaking, which frankly contain our homeownership efforts, our supply side rental efforts, our preservation of rental efforts, our efforts to ensure that we have opportunities and continue to develop opportunities for folks who've been disadvantaged and have not had an opportunity to participate in small business development and growth. And so would like to ask you all to speak about your strategies as it relates to linking affordable housing or housing affordability with economic development and impacting communities. And then what folks ought to be doing and how they ought to be thinking about it. And, go ahead and be daring in this. And what I'll say is, for the local governments who are listening, the folks who are from those, DC, stand up. Other folks, y'all might need to show up. So Philip, why don't you start with this part of it?
I mean, I think if you're asking about how other local governments are going to stand up on this,
Well, or how they ought to.
I mean, I don't want to be trite, but whenever we do whenever we work with local governments, we always say three things. In a lot of places in the country, one of the three isn't possible, but we always say you got to have land use and development approval process that actually lets your housing market respond. And that's a foundation, because no amount of subsidy, you can't spend enough money to actually fix that. It takes about $20,000 to knock rent down $100 a unit. You don't have the money. Then you got to have subsidy, because there's going to be some households that don't have the income because the way our economy works, or just cannot earn. And so they're never going to be able to afford the cost to build or maintain a home. So you can't do this without subsidy. You can't just do land use. And then you have to have tenants' rights, and you have to have balanced tenants' rights. Landlords and tenants are different parties in a business transaction, and they negotiate against each other. And that's totally normal and healthy, as long as but it's more than just a business transaction. It's someone's home. So the rights have to be more balanced. I do a lot of work in the Southeast. Tenants' rights are not a thing that exists in the Southeast. You could look back to the laws that, around sharecropping, and they basically still drive tenant law in, about a third of our country. But that's the balance we always try to push everyone to. Is like, okay, so what are you doing on subsidy, and how are we being smart there? What are we doing on land use? So we're taking the pressure off, but not doing displacement, because you can upzone and displace, or you can upzone and create supply. It's one or not the other. And then what can you do on tenants' rights? And if you live somewhere where there aren't tenants' rights, so I'm looking at anybody here on the Richmond, Virginia side, you can still spend money to pay for people to have lawyers to those things. There are still things you can do. You cannot, you should vote differently in your state legislator potentially, but you can, there are still things you can do with money to help balance that situation. And we really try to push folks to have a comprehensive approach. And generally, I find that the red places I work, they're pretty good on land use and pretty terrible on tenants' rights and subsidy. And the blue places I work are pretty good on subsidy and tenants' rights, but pretty terrible on land use. And it's really rare that we find a place like, I think Minneapolis has struggled on many things, but they have been a place that's like pretty good on tenants' rights, has some subsidy, and is trying to do better on land use. Now they're also getting sued, so we'll see whether they can actually implement anything. But trying to find that balance and have that conversation. And I deal with it with my own neighbors. I mentioned this before, like my neighbors are happy to pay higher taxes to support affordable housing, and I'm really proud of that. They're also generally opposed to building more housing in our neighborhood, and trying to get them to understand that those two things are not irreconcilable. There's a staff person who's got his picture is his background is a picture of two signs in a yard in DC, and one's, everyone is welcome here. This is a house that respects everyone. And then the sign next to it is don't build something in DuPont Circle area. So that same house, that household is saying, yes, we love everyone, but you're not allowed to live anywhere near us. And frankly, trying to politely call people on the hypocrisy of those statements. You can't argue it both ways.
Excellent. Charles?
Yes, well, I think that, from my personal experience in working across the country, that Babatunde and Philip are correct, that DC is really on the forefront of its policy with land use. The mayor's equitable development initiative, which CSG took a part in. The first project that went through that program was the Langston Slater redevelopment on a P Street. And we came up with the idea that we were going to turn these two in-cap schools, they're old schools that were defunct, and there was a middle piece. So we collaborated with Habitat for Humanities and Volunteers of America, and we're going to do resident affordable rental housing in the schools, and we're going to build 2-over-2 townhouses for a home ownership, with the Douglas Land Trust being in charge of making sure the sort of caretaker for the land to make sure it's always affordable ownership, with the the owners coming in and getting some appreciation and leaving some back, so that the next owner can have affordable home ownership. I think that can be replicable. I think the mayor is very serious about it. A few days ago, we had a meeting with her and 6 other projects under the equitable development and affordable housing. And she brought in all the department heads and says, what do you need? Let's move this on. That's telling. I've never seen that anywhere else. But the thing I really want to push, because Philip touched on something, which is, land use, collaborations. We have DC, specifically the Washington region, per capita has more churches, ranked 4th in the country. I mean, you can throw a rock, as they say, and hit a church in this region. All these churches, not all of them have excess land, but a lot of them do. They're waiting for someone to say, how can you help me utilize this better? Congregations are down across the country. Even the Catholic Church recognizes this. I was invited to Rome to the first ever Catholic land use initiative. And then I went to Notre Dame to the Fitzgerald Institute. The church, the American Baptist Church, has asked me, churches are looking, YMCAs, there are 2,700 Y facilities across the country. There are a bunch here in the DC region. They're all looking for people to help them figure out what is the next step, the evolution in their mission, their ministry, and affordable housing is front and center. There's your land use. Now we need to figure out the capital stack, the feasibility. Enterprise obviously has the faith-based housing initiative that'll give you, feasibility and pre-development money. It's all there. Putting the pieces together, I think, is our job. But I think there are opportunities to really increase affordable housing, utilizing land that's available, especially in urban areas. It's just up to us to put the pieces together.
Excellent. Thank you. Babatunde. You're on mute.
I think that I've been talking about, this thread throughout the conversation about community building, right? And making sure that everyone participates in the project. Everyone is a part of it. And I think that is going to be critical going forward. I think it's always been critical. We just haven't recognized it. And we haven't been as intentional as we should have been in terms of making that happen. And I know there's a lot of factors that get involved, right? When you look at a development project, the project is basically money, right? It's money and how quickly you can execute. And sometimes getting all those community pieces together doesn't work with a timeline of a project, right? And so that's why that intentionality, that planning has to occur way in advance, right? Before you even get to the groundbreaking, so that you understand and what the lay of the land is and how to maneuver to make sure all those pieces work in concert so that you really have an impactful project. And I think that takes a lot of muscle power, a lot of brain power to do. And I think for a lot of people, a lot of developers, it's just not in their best interest to do that. But that's going to have to change if we really want to see the impact that we're looking to achieve, right? Like, we all have great ideas. And I think what Charles has said in the past with his project on P Street. I mean, we would all love to do something like that. I mean, that's something that is transformational, right? But it takes time, right? You have to really sit down and think about how all these pieces work together.
Excellent. Emmy?
Yeah, I just sort of want to highlight the importance of like how useful the HIT tool is in terms of like coming up with regional solutions, right? A lot of these problems, they don't have the same geographic barriers that we impose, right? People are getting displaced from DC to the suburbs, and now the same people are getting displaced from suburbs to the more suburbs, right? And so that displacement of entrepreneurs, of homeowners and things like that, how do we ensure sort of that cycle doesn't continue? I think the other important aspect of this is that employees no longer have to move to where employers are, right? Employers move to regions where they have a good workforce availability already. And so there's reasons that Amazon and things like our businesses like that are coming to this region. Ensuring that we actually have that workforce here means that they have housing options in this area, and that they have the security that they need to be able to feel safe and comfortable in this area. But these solutions, you know, what DC is doing in sort of leading the charge in can really only be impactful if there's some collaborative nature amongst government. And there's one thing I learned during the pandemic is that like local governments don't talk to each other, right? One of our roles during the pandemic was to help disperse COVID related funding. Everybody had CARES Act funding and ARPA funding, and they were all managing it in different ways, leading grants for entrepreneurs. And one of the roles we played is telling them, well, this is what Fairfax County is doing. This is what Montgomery County is doing, and things like that, because they weren't talking to each other and they have very similar needs. And
Right.
For me, it's how I think that's one role that nonprofits play in this, is sort of bridging that gap that local government has. But it really needs to be, that collaboration needs to be much more intentional. And we need to fund the organizations that are doing that work.
Excellent. Jackie?
So, thinking about your placemaking question and the importance of neighborhood investment and how we can, think about that. Organizations such as the community builders and other larger nonprofits, some of us are CDFIs as well. And so we have been really trying to look at the challenges that are facing the communities that we serve, and how can we leverage that with new market tax credits to really focus on, food deserts, bringing in, local entrepreneurs and other businesses to occupy some of our commercial spaces. We've been trying to see how we can leverage our organization and our resources to benefit the communities that we serve. And I think that should be always at the forefront. It's not about just the real estate development. It is about we are a neighborhood stakeholder, and how can we help the transformation of the entire neighborhood? What resources besides housing can we bring to the table? And so we have been focusing on that in our work throughout all of our areas. We just recently were awarded $4 million by the Fannie Mae Foundation to pilot an FSS program, which is great. So we're focusing on Black home ownership in Richmond and in Chicago and some of our other communities, that we're trying to leverage our resources and invest, right? So we want to be part of the solution and acknowledge that if we can leverage our balance sheets and our experience to help contribute, that's what we should be doing as partners.
Excellent, excellent. So folks, we are winding down. This has been, I wish we had another hour, because I have probably 20 more questions that we could get to. But what I want to do is give everyone about 30 seconds for parting words. And before I do that, I want to thank you all on hand for this discussion today. It's been extraordinary, and I'm hopeful that we won't just bump into each other at TOD efforts, but that we'll keep in touch and figure out how to grow our relationships so that this region can thrive. It's home for me. It's home for my family. And so I want it to do as well as it can. So with that, we'll offer Mr. King first, and then you all can self-select for your 30-second bow out.
Sure. Well, thank you again for the invitation. I think the HIT 3.0 is a great tool. I started playing with it as you did, Emmy. And I said, wow, this is a wealth of great information that can be useful, because you really do have to target. You only have so many hours in the day, and you have to be, as I said, resourceful. give you an example, the DC Green Bank, which, you know, is a fairly new entity, will provide pre-development monies for affordable housing projects as long as you do a 5-star energy related project. Well, an electrification, well, that's the future anyway. So there are these different entities and different sources of capital, as well as the collaborations, you know, your neighborhood church or a church that you go by every day and you see land. I would just be proactive as a developer, as a nonprofit or for-profit, and be patient, because this again is not the easy, let's go get a bank loan and let's get some friends and family to contribute some money and we're off to the races and we're flipping houses. That is not this.
I guess I'll go next. I want to thank Han for the opportunity to participate on this panel. This has been great for me. I know I've learned a lot and definitely want to connect with the rest of the panelists going forward. I think there's a lot of good work that we can do together with our organizations. I guess my parting word or words are, you know, we're in a very interesting time right now in terms of just the world in general. And I think that we have to stay focused and realize that it is a slow burn. Nothing comes quick, nothing comes easy. And as long as you stay focused and diligent in what you're doing, the success will come and you can create the projects that will have that significant impact on people's lives. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to remember housing is about lives. It's about human lives, right? And as long as you keep that as your guiding star, I think that will drive you into making the best decisions possible, right? Because this work really does have a profound impact on people's lives.
I'll go next. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity for today. I think it's always great to fellowship and to learn and to talk and just have a real honest dialogue about the challenges that we're facing in our work. I think what's important to remember, and others have said it already, that this is a long-term strategic deployment. Let's look at it that way, right? We are challenged with forces that we can't control. We're challenged by economic environments that we can't control, but if we stay committed, if we stay focused, if we look at this as a partnership, as an effort of advocacy, it's holding people accountable, that we can truly make the impact that we want. But it requires us to be focused and unforgiving. I think, you know, to push and make sure that we hold our locality partners, our public officials, ourselves, our organizations such as HAND and MHC and others, that we have to push the envelope. We can't just continue to accept status quo, that we have to demand more and more excellence, because we have to remind people about who are we serving. We are serving most of the people within our region. If 46% of Americans, based on what LaToya had given us this information, if 46% of Americans spend more than 30% of their income on housing, then we know that this is a national issue. And so we have to make sure that we stay focused and we use all of our efforts to really tackle this challenge, and we just stay steady. So, and don't forget that we have to raise up folks behind us to take our places. I think sometimes we think that we're the only ones who can do it, but we have to make sure that we're preparing the next generation. And I think that's important. Thank you.
I will try to follow that, and I think mostly echo that, like, this is a long-term effort. This is an ongoing effort that will outlast probably everyone on this call. I think the HIT tool is a really powerful way to make sure that this, for all of us to take and everyone on the call to take and use, is make sure this stays on the policy agenda, that this stays a tier 1 political issue at the local government, the state government level, and to agree at the, we can at the federal level. That's that sustained effort, I think, that was really powerful within the tool to put actual households and their pictures up there. I think learning to how, while we have to keep pushing on this, we have to keep somewhat changing and tweaking our language about how we talk about this, because people get calloused about some of the ways we talk about it. Orphans and widows will always work, but there's also, this is a huge problem. So how we keep using the HIT tool and other tools to keep pushing on this. I think really is going to be the driver of this. We're in a pivot point. Is this going to stay a priority? Or is there going to remain a policy priority? Is there going to be ongoing investment here? And I think we all have to be pushing right now to make sure it doesn't slide down the agenda. And it's nice to be on this panel and hear folks doing amazing work. And frankly, I'm learning a lot from, and know that there's a larger group pushing on these things, and that none of us are on our own to do this. But I think just making sure that we're holding folks responsible, and then we're using, when people have done the research and done the work, that we're calling that out and bringing it and not getting knocked off track. Like this is the truth. These are people's lives. They're dealing with circumstances that are unfair, that are unwinnable circumstances for them. And that's because of decisions and policies we're all party to, and we have an obligation to change that.
Just to jump on that point, I think Heather made a point in her introduction that affordability doesn't discriminate, right? It impacts us, our nurses, our doctors, really every sector of our lives as citizens of this region. And so it's very important to me that this tool is something that is a call to action, right? There's a section for every little organization, government entity, faith-based organizations, law firms, like everyone plays a role in addressing the affordable housing needs of our region. And I appreciate really that it has the numbers, right, of our local elected officials on there. There's that accountability standpoint. And we can't say we don't know who to call or email because we have those resources at our hands. And so I really just want to sort of highlight how important initiatives like this are, and just like thank the HAND team once again, because I think it's so useful for all of the organizations as we do our strategic planning for the future, right? As we strategize and evaluate what programs are effective or where we need to launch. It is a very useful thing to have. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, panelists. And LaToya, back to you.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Courtney Battle to close us out today.
All right. Thank you, LaToya. And thank you again to all of our speakers and all of our guests this morning. Such an amazing dialogue. Huge thank you to everyone who participated and logged in. My name is Courtney Battle, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Membership for HAND. As LaToya mentioned, we're at the point in our program where we're going to wrap things up and send everyone on their way. But I think I can speak for all of us when I say that what happens when we leave here today is even more important than any of the data that we discussed. HAND is committed to working with each of you as we continue to seek more equitable outcomes through the vehicle of housing. And we hope that this year's update to the HIT will be a valuable resource to you. We also look forward to convening our region's housing directors, elected officials, and other stakeholders over the coming months through HIT activations, where we continue this conversation, hear what's working in and around the region, and work together to move the needle. I'd also like to echo Heather's acknowledgements that she shared at the top of the program, not only to our sponsors, Amazon, the Greater Washington Community Foundation, Truist, and Wells Fargo, but to our research team at Urban Institute, LaToya Thomas with Brick and Story, and all of our speakers today. In planning today's session, it was really, really important to us to bring in practitioners who were charged with working with our government partners to execute on these bold and audacious goals, and we truly appreciate such a thought-provoking discussion. As a reminder, the tool is officially live, so you can check it out at hit.handhousing.org. We encourage you to share it with your colleagues as well. And if you're interested in scheduling a demo with the HIT team or have any questions for us, we're more than happy to assist. So feel free to drop us a line. And lastly, I can't leave you without a shameless plug for all that we have coming up. If you haven't already seen, registration is officially open for the 32nd Annual HAND Honors. Many of you are familiar with HAND's annual meeting. This is the same event, just a different name. We hope that you'll be able to join us on June 21st at the Kennedy Center. If you haven't locked in your registration yet, you can do so at our website, www.handhousing.org. We welcome over 1,000 housing and community development professionals each year to this event. So great opportunity to connect with others working in the space and recognize our peers for the work that they're doing. So please don't wait to get your tickets. And also we look forward to connecting with each of you very soon. And just thank you again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.